So, hello, Michele Levine. Michele Levine is the Chief Executive of Roy Morgan Research, and we're here to talk about the latest Roy Morgan poll, which has just been released just this minute, really, which is the first post-election poll after a very interesting election, Michele. So,
Sure.
would you like us to take us through the headline numbers there?
Well, the poll heading is that the Nationals failed to get a post-election bounce, but the leaderless Labor Party crashed to the lowest ever support. So what the Morgan poll found in its first poll after the election is that the Nationals have dropped 3.5%, down to 43.5 since the election, and that the Labor Party have dropped even a whole lot more, so that the Labor Party are down to, 22.5%.
Yeah, so they're down 2.6%, which, and they have polled. That's the lowest polling rate that they've had on Roy Morgan, but I think they've polled as low as 23 before, haven't they?
Look, our data or our records show that that's the lowest since the 1914 New Zealand election. So it's a really long time since they've been anywhere near that low.
Yeah, certainly in an election. But during the election, the polls leading up to the election, we saw them sort of ranging between, I think, about 23 and about sort of 27.
Right.
And they ended up getting 24.5 or something, which I think is a number which we're all very familiar with here now. So the first of all, let's talk a little bit about national falling, because that's a reasonably significant fall, but that's not unusual.
No, look, in the Australian context, we would expect to see a honeymoon period. You know, once you've actually had a party elected, it's like everyone sort of rallies around and the election's over and it's all good. And you'd expect to see a kind of honeymoon period, even the vote going up, but at least holding. But in New Zealand, it seems over the last couple of elections, that's just not the way that it works. So for the winning party to actually lose support isn't unusual in New Zealand.
So why do we think that? Well, what do we think is the reason for Australian honeymoon post-polling bounces? Because I think we see those internationally too, don't we?
Yes, look, I think so, and it seems psychologically sensible, doesn't it? You know, you've actually made a call, and that's what you do. You support what the country's actually decided. And look, the only thing we can think of in New Zealand is that without enforced voting, without people having to vote, you possibly have those people who didn't turn up to vote actually feeling like, well, the party that they selected hasn't been successful and they sort of wish they had. Maybe that's part of the deal.
Right, because I think because often it's a sort of like a confirmation bias thing, where people would like to say that they voted for the winning party, even perhaps if they didn't.
Yes. Well, maybe New Zealanders don't feel that need to jump onto the bandwagon.
Well, that would be interesting. So the other interesting thing that we've seen here in this poll too is New Zealand First support is still high. It's down a little bit, but it's at 7%, down 1.6%. And the Conservative Party is at their highest ever polling rating, which is at 5 for Roy Morgan. And they had polled that level prior to the election in some of the other polls, but not Roy Morgan. It surprises me somewhat that the Conservative Party, because that again plays into the same sort of slightly strange logic that you'd think that people who had voted Conservatives would be so disappointed that they failed to. They got 4%, but they failed to get any representation at all. That they at that point might change their minds about who they're voting, but instead their voting is growing.
Oh, look, I don't think that you can actually guess as to why people respond with these things in a week after the polling. I think the best thing that you can do is to actually look at what was the nation saying before the election. What did they say? Who did they say they wanted to win? And how are they going to vote? And then after the election, it's a kind of funny period. It really is, because you've actually, if an election were held today, who would you vote for? It's almost a nonsense. So, I don't think we can get too much into the psychology. But some of the other really interesting things are, I think, the Green vote. And I think understanding the Green vote is pretty important, because we often find that Greens are overestimated. Support for the Green Party can often be overestimated, and particularly in New Zealand, but also in Australia. And we saw in this coming up to the New Zealand election, all of the polls, this wasn't just a Roy Morgan phenomenon, overestimating Green support, all of the polls were showing the Greens likely to get more votes than they actually did.
Close to 15, and they ended up getting 11, I think, didn't they?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's quite a substantial drop, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things that it's really worth understanding, because there's a couple of things that go on, I think, here. One is to do with who actually turns up and votes. Because in New Zealand, you can have everybody might support you, but if they don't bother to turn up and vote, then it doesn't do you a lot of good. And we think really with the Greens that it's most likely that you would have younger people not bothering to turn up and vote. You know, maybe they're first-time electors, maybe younger people are just less reliable. So that's an important factor for the Greens. But the other thing too is that we see in Australia that, and it may well be the same in New Zealand, that the Greens are still seen a little bit like a protest party. So people will support Greens emotionally and they'll want to support Greens, but when you get into the actual box to sign and say how you're going to vote, it's a quite serious event. You know, I don't know whether you've noticed it, but when you go in, it's not just, I'm going to vote Green. You don't think protest. It's quite serious. And people do tend to come back and support a major party.
Right. Although in the case of the Labour Party's votes now at a very low level. So in this latest poll, we have the Greens at 17.5% and Labour at 22.5%. And it occurs to me that that's probably almost as bigger headline as the ones that you've picked in your release, in the sense that the Green Party is now closer to Labour than I think it's ever been.
Yes. Yes. Look, I think that's really important, and I'm sure both the Greens and the Labor Party will be looking very closely at these figures. You know, the Labor Party, obviously, this is a really difficult time for them without a leader at this point. Partly they will be saying, well, what would you expect without a leader? You know, we need to have a leader. We need to regroup. I'm sure they'll be saying they need to regroup and really think about where they will go and what will be their vision and all of those sorts of things. But I think they would also have to be looking at that Green number and saying, gee, we are about on par with the Greens. That will be a really big issue.
Yeah, so in terms of that, I mean, in addition to them not having a leader, we also have the problem that there's been a lot of fractiousness. I mean, there's been a lot of negativity and a lot of harsh words said by Labour Party people about other Labour Party people. How does the public generally respond to that sort of?
Look, the public hates it when politicians and public servants and people who are supposed to be leaders and behaving like leaders misbehave. So the public really hates any of those kinds of disputes and public displays of anger and things like that. People just don't like that. But, you know, you'd have to say at this point in time, the Labor Party has got a little while before they really need to, I suppose, strut their stuff. And they have got an opportunity to say, we'll find the right leader, we will find the right messaging, and we'll, you know, they need a clear vision to be seen as a very sensible alternative, and then, you know, a potential leading party. But they have got time to do that.
So looking forward over the next month, we're going to see this Labour Party election race shape up now. So I mean, until now, there's been this sort of phony war of deciding who was going to stand, and now we know who the candidates are. And I mean, last time they had this primary election, there was a lot of exposure of the candidates, and there was a lot of discussion about their visions and so forth. And over the course of that period, the Labour Party had showed a dramatic improvement. But the key to that happening again would be that this campaign is conducted in a way that they all look as though they're good leaders. I mean, would you give any advice to them?
Well, I think you've just given the advice. I think the advice is that everyone has to behave like a leader. I mean, the people of New Zealand actually don't want silly people or aggressive people. They want leaders. They want people who are actually talking about a vision, who are talking about how they're going to achieve what's needed for New Zealand. And every one of the people needs to be able to perform like a statesman. And I think that's kind of obvious. But no doubt when these kerfuffles get on, you know, sometimes they get dirty, and you just hope that it won't be too bad. And at the end of the day, whoever is the leader will actually come out with the right sort of vision.
Now, there's one final question I'd like to ask you, which relates to what happened during the election itself, and the dirty politics scandal and the Kim.com factor in this election, which were very unusual and attracted an enormous amount of attention. I mean, do you have a view as to why those things seem to have ended up favouring National as opposed to the opposition?
Look, I think what we have to say, and it's really interesting because this was such an extraordinary election, and it felt like there were so many things going on, and yet when you look at the data, almost nothing changed. From the last election to this election, the people basically voted pretty much the same way. And I think that's one of the things we have to remember. As people who follow polls really closely, we tend to think that the whole population is living and breathing polls and politicians and all of these things. The reality is average people are going about living their lives and doing what they do, and the things that matter to them are jobs, is where the country's going. Do they feel confident with the leader? And they're not following all of the kerfuffle to the extent that we might think they are. And I think this latest result in New Zealand actually showed just that. And of course, you've actually got people feeling quite confident in the way the country's going. I mean, if you'd had a different situation, if coming up to the election, the people of New Zealand were really concerned about the way the economy was going, the way New Zealand was going, and they were very, very worried, I think you would have seen a very different situation. They would have been looking a lot more closely. And
so that's why so the confidence rating is 65%, which is 137, I think, which is still 65% of the population think that the country's going in the right direction.
Yes.
So on that basis, you're not at all surprised with this election result. I mean, that's usually the leading indicator.
No, I think, look, there are no hard and fast rules about this, but generally, if you've got a confidence rating below 100, you can kind of expect that there could be a change of government. Once it's above 100, it's much less likely. But this confidence rating is very high in New Zealand, much higher than Australia. It's a very, New Zealand is not feeling too terribly pressured. Now, what comes in the next year or so could change that to an extraordinary degree. How New Zealanders feel about the direction that the country's going, whether they get concerned about terrorism or whether they feel the economy's tanking, those things I think will actually change the dynamic even more than some of the political infighting, which, to some extent people hate, but they don't watch it all the time. It's not so important to them.
It's almost infotainment.
I think it might be.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle, and looking forward to your next poll.
Terrific. My pleasure.